gonna
All right. I can try the screen share now if you want to try that real quick.
Do you want to try it too, Chris?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do that if you can.
So, share screen. All right.
You just have to make sure, because when you share, you also hit share audio at the bottom.
Okay. Is that not currently going?
No, so we can't hear the audio. So if you stop screen sharing and then, let's see. And then try to re-share and then click before you hit share. It should be in the bottom.
Share sound. Yep. There we go.
Okay. So then you should, we should be able to hear it now.
Okay.
And
Okay,
standard
great. We can hear
loads,
it.
mix it up.
It'll be cheap.
Working?
Great.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Amazing.
Sorry, guys.
No, I'm glad we got to work this out so we didn't have to stop midway through. So I'm gonna go ahead and launch into just like a quick introduction for everybody, pass it to Robert, and then we'll pass it over to you all to introduce yourselves and your background a little bit. But hi everyone, my name is Alexandria. I am the program manager at Real Stories, and we are a nonprofit organization based in the East Bay of Northern California. And for nearly 10 years, we have been working with female and non-binary middle and high school youth filmmakers, and really teaching them the filmmaking skills they need from the ground up. So we work with very introductory filmmakers that have never held the equipment before or never learned about what it is and what it entails to make a movie. And we also work with some advanced returning high school and college students as well. We are now a part of a larger organization, Bay Area Video Coalition, that is our home now. And they are also based in the Bay Area, San Francisco primarily. And they work with all types of gender affiliated youth filmmakers. So they work with men, non-binary, trans, female filmmakers to really also train them and equip them with the skills it takes to find their voice, tell those really important stories, and just keep uplifting areas of our world that we don't typically get to hear stories from on a daily basis. So together, our youth programs have, over the last year, just in and of itself, worked with hundreds of students, both locally in the Bay Area, and also since we've gone virtual, we've been able to work with students across the nation and a few of them internationally. And it's been really incredible. It's like our silver lining to kind of what happened with the pandemic is that we've been able to attract more of a national and even international audience. So that is a little bit about the work that we do. But for the last month, we have been teaming with Robert and his crew at Animal Kingdom to just bring these weekly discussions with some just incredibly successful powerhouse creators, writers, directors, editors. And so we're really excited to have Ian, Tan, and Chris Visser here today to join us and share with us not just about their background and their passions, but also a little bit about their work on Animal Kingdom and the technical side as well, which is just really great to get that insight and to have it be a longer discussion so we can get into the nitty gritty aspects. So I'm going to pass over to Robert, who I'd love to have Robert share a little bit about himself before we pass it over to our guest speakers.
My name's Robert Scott. I got my start producing punk rock shows in Hawaii, and did a little bit of cable access programming as well. I broke into the television industry thanks to the Directors Guild of America Assistant Director Training Program, which I encourage as anybody who's interested in taking a path toward producing. It is a fantastic opportunity for folks who may not have connections in the industry, and it's been specifically designed to counteract the nepotism that sometimes helps people get ahead in the industry, and also is designed to help minorities and women help break into industries, the television industry. I am extremely excited to hear from Chris and Ian today, since I left college, I haven't done any editing, and editing was one of the most exciting processes in the filmmaking work. And so I'm extremely excited to hear their views, their tips, how they broke in, etc. So if you don't mind, shall we start with Chris? if you'd like to tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got in the business,
Sure.
what your background is.
Sure. So I'm Chris Visser. I am from a small town in Wisconsin called Oconomowoc, which every other letter is an O, so that's fun. Um, and I went to Marquette University in Milwaukee for broadcast and electronic communication, which is the general degree, but I basically treated it as I'm just gonna use all the equipment to make short films with my friends. And I got into filmmaking right after my freshman year of high school. There was like a after school video making class that was offered, and all my other friends were taking it. So I thought, why not? I'll go take it too. And that really changed the trajectory of my whole life, because if I hadn't taken that class, I wouldn't be on this Zoom call right now, I assume. But so I kept doing video stuff in high school, went to college for it. And then kind of the big reason why I'm in LA, not the only reason, but a bigger reason, was that I applied for the Emmys Foundation internships, which happen every year. There's like 40 different categories, from directing in both single cam and multicam, writing, cinematography. There again, all the different parts of the industry, they have a category for, and they pair you with an 8-week internship with a company or a show or something in LA. It's a paid, small paid, but you get basically a living stipend to be in LA for 8 weeks. And I applied for the post-production internship category my junior year of college, and thankfully got it. Spent the summer in LA working at a company called Chainsaw, which is now owned by the company called Sim Digital. But at the time, this is 2011, so I was, in the machine room, learning from people, but also like by the end of the internship, I had gained the trust of the assistant editor, so that I was actually doing work orders. So I was doing imports on the Avid and doing exports, and I was able to, shadow people who were working on like MTV's Teen Wolf season 1, which again, this is, and FX's Wilfred. So this is dated, obviously, to 2011. So I don't even, most of the shows the scripted shows that we were working at the time, I don't think are on air anymore. But other stuff like American Idol, So You Think You Can Dance, these kind of like juggernaut competition shows were other things that I got to see. And then I went back, graduated after my senior year, and then actually got a job working for Chainsaw right out of college. Thankfully, kept those connections going while I was back home for that year, and was able to work, as a nighttime assistant editor. So 10 p.m. to 8 a.m. shift was my first job out of college in LA, which very grateful for, because I was able to, because of my previous relationship with Chainsaw, I was able to skip PA and go right to a nighttime assistant editor, which I'm very grateful for. And that's an incredibly privileged thing that happened to me. But it was also working the graveyard shift, which is not a great way to live. But thankfully that wasn't too long, and I left that company, started another smaller company, and did a bunch of reality TV. I was doing we were doing a lot of live event to live to tape shows, so like the MTV Movie Awards, the VMAs, a lot of the BET award shows, where we would create the packages that would go into the show, and then we would also do the edit of the show once it, like, either if it was a live to tape where they act like it's live, but they record it and then they put it out as if it's a live show, or if it's a live show where it is like airing that night, but then they re-air it the next day. So you cut it down so it fits to commercial time. So I did that for a couple of years, and then obviously in LA, it's all about networking and making connections. And so through some connections, I was able to get my first starting scripted in 2017 on a Shooter for season 2 for USA, working with an editor named Zach Arnold, who's a really great editor, who's worked on Burn Notice and Empire and a bunch of other stuff before I worked with him. And then worked on a couple shows with Zach before eventually lucking into working with Ian, and I've been working with Ian for the past 6 shows now, so it's been great. So that's kind of a really quick catch up of my journey from high school to now. I don't know if Ian wants to take it away on his background.
Certainly. Go ahead, Robert.
But just to quickly comment, as Chris had mentioned, I think interning is incredibly important in helping to introduce ourselves to the industry, and also the industry to us, like getting your foot in the door, and as you did, get a job through the success that you had in the internship. That I had the same experience myself following college. And so any opportunity that any of the folks out there might have to do that, I highly encourage it. It's a tremendous opportunity. And if you ever have the chance, you should definitely jump at it. I'm sorry, Ian, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, Robert. My name is Ian Tan. I am one of 3 editors on Animal Kingdom. My start, well, I come from a very small town, much like Chris in the Midwest, except I'm from a small town called Munster, Indiana. After graduating from high school, I went to Washington University in St. Louis, where I got my degree in biology. I was pre-med at the time, and then my senior year, I decided that's not the direction I wanted to go with my life. And I decided to dive into films, which was always my love and my passion. Like I always, when my dad had a video camera, I was like 6 at the time. It was Betamax still, if you can believe that, even what that is. I was making stop motion Lego movies before there was ever such a thing as a stop motion Lego movie. I'm the original Lego movie. So after graduating from WashU, I went to Florida State. They have a very excellent film school there. Graduated with an MFA in film recording, and moved out here to LA in 2001, shortly after 9/11 happened. So thankfully, I'm going to go ahead and echo what Robert was saying earlier about internships. I applied to the ACE internship. For those who don't know, ACE stands for the American Cinema Editors. They have a very excellent internship program where from a pool of candidates, they pick 2 and they put them in various venues. I think nowadays they do reality, but at the time I did a feature, I did a movie of the week, I did a scripted television show, and and various post house, that sort of thing. You get to spend a week on each of them, and you really get to grow your network of contacts, which both Chris and Robert have said. That's essentially the bones of your career there. That's where you find your work. So thankfully, I was able to make some excellent contacts with them. One of whom I was paired with an editor on the hit show at the time called CSI, Crime Scene Investigation. And once I left that show, I kept in touch with them. And so, to make a long story short, I did a bunch of odd jobs just trying to survive the post 9/11 economic fallout. There weren't a lot of shows at the time, but there was a lot of unscripted reality TV shows that were coming out. So I was able to get my foot in the door, PAing on one of those shows and rising through the ranks, becoming an assistant editor on scripted, and finally making the jump to a scripted assistant editor on CSI. And from then going from show to show until landed here at Animal Kingdom. So that's where I am now.
I seem to, when I looked you up on IMDb, Ian, I noticed you had worked on a bunch of shorts, which looked amazing. And you also had some credits as director and writing on those. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure, certainly. I think, like a lot of those shorts that Robert's referring to, I did in film school. And one of the great things about film school is that you put your entire focus into learning how to make films, And for someone like me who really didn't have a lot of experience in it, it was a good way for me to learn a little bit about everything from writing, from pre-production to production, all the way to post-production, from writing and conceiving the script all the way through shooting it and eventually finishing it and editing. So I think that if you are someone who's strongly considering a career in film and TV making, film school is an excellent way to go, because you get to experience a little bit of everything, and you really just kind of focus on maybe some of the things that interest you more. If you like to shoot more, maybe that's what you want to do. If you want to direct, then that's something to focus on. Or if you want to do editing, maybe that's how you'll discover your passion, which is actually how I discovered that I wanted to do editing, was through film school. I just discovered that I had kind of like a knack for it. I would strongly recommend just trying everything once because it's all interconnected. I mean, you can't have one without the other. For instance, I mean, I've learned so much about directing just through editing, just because you're constantly working with the footage, you're constantly dealing with all these little pieces. And the more time you spend with it, the more you figure out what works and what doesn't. And it just shapes your craft that much better.
And I think, and Ian, I noticed that you had done some shadowing on the set of one of our directors this season, actually Mark Strand.
Yes, that's correct.
And Mark Strand, also an editor on our show. And one of the ways to break into directing, some people have been able to achieve is working on a show, an established show, and you become a trusted member of the team, and you can express to the producers that you're interested in trying something new, as Ian was mentioning, and they might give you a shot at directing. And as Ian said, and we touched on in an earlier seminar, everything is interrelated. And I had a friend who, when he wanted to direct, he would read books on acting, and when he wanted to act, he would read books on directing, because it's all about an interplay and how to work with the other departments. So Ian, where do you stand in your aim towards directing? Are you have you done much since those shorts? Would this be a new step for you in scripted television?
Good question. I mean, since those shorts, I mean, I've done a few side projects, but nothing to the extent that I was able to do with film school. Because again, with film school, I mean, it's completely immersive. That's all you kind of, especially graduate school, that's all you kind of live, eat, and breathe. It's a little more challenging when you're trying to work, you know, especially if you're editing 10 hours a day. It really takes a lot of discipline to carve out time to sit down, write a script, and, you know, get a crew together and you know, shoot something and then put it together. You know, I've definitely had a number of ideas that I've bounced around and scripts that I've written, but so far I just haven't really had the opportunity to do it. I would like to explore directing more someday. I don't know how soon that would be if it were to happen, but it's definitely a door I would like to keep open. So I feel I owe it to myself to keep learning and developing my craft in that direction. Right.
And I think what you said earlier about film school as being a tremendous opportunity when you have the time and the energy and access to the equipment and other people who are interested in the same thing, as far as being able to collaborate and crew up together. I think that's a tremendous opportunity, and the folks in the Bay Area Video Coalition have that opportunity right now. Even if just having access to the equipment and mentorships and classes, the work that they're doing is amazing, and I encourage all of them to produce their stories and express their express what they're feeling in the form of stories, and communicate those ideas to the world. Now, Chris and Ian, you both seem to talk about reality the reality TV world as a sort of a big career beginning step. Chris, can you talk a little bit about what reality is like, what editing reality is like, and then maybe touch on the difference between that and scripted television?
Sure. So, I mean, the reason a lot of people start in reality is because there's so much more work there. You know, working in entertainment is a small group, and then working in scripted entertainment is a much smaller group. And so there's just a lot of reality TV shows out there. So it's it's a great, with the huge boost that the writer's strike gave to reality TV. There's so many more ways for people to get into the industry, and a lot of those skills do translate somewhat to the scripted world. In reality, I never edited in reality TV. I only assisted, and then I made the transition from assisting in reality to assisting in scripted. So I can't super speak to editing it. But in terms of reality, I feel like troubleshooting is like the name of the game for a lot of assistant editors, but it's especially the name of the game for reality assistant editors, because a lot of shows are shooting in a lot of different formats. There might not be always the most clear plan on how they're doing everything. And even when there are, things just kind of run amok. So one of the big things that I took away from working in reality was like being incredibly flexible and quick on my feet of like how to diagnose and fix a problem for either how to get footage into our editing software, which, I've been mostly using Avid this entire time that I've been in LA, occasionally working in Premiere as well, which if you're going to work in scripted TV or if that's a goal, definitely I recommend people learning Avid, even though more and more people are, using Premiere. It's good to know more software than just, one. So like when I was in school, Final Cut Pro 7 and Avid were the two big ones. So I learned both and I, at school, I only used Final Cut Pro 7, and at my corporate video job I had, I only used Avid just so I was using both. Anyway, that's an aside. Whether it's like getting the footage in or getting the footage out, there's always seems to be something awry in reality. So it was a lot of troubleshooting, and just like the volume of work is a lot more, especially on these shows where they basically are following people around with 8, 10, 20 cameras all day. So there's just a lot of footage, and you have to be really organized with it, and you have to kind of get to know the limits of your software really easily and really quickly. So that's kind of like, I learned how my software worked really well in reality. That was like one of the biggest translating things. But then when you move over to scripted, it's like learning the politics of the room. As assistant editors in reality TV, you're not really dealing with the producers, you're not really dealing with the directors, etc. And there's not as much of a personal relationship between the assistant editors and the editors, because there's usually a bunch of assistant editors and a bunch of editors, and it's just like who's available to take on this task. Whereas in scripted, the vast majority of the cases you have a one-on-one relationship with an editor and assistant, and that's really beneficial and awesome, because you can, if you have a good relationship with your editor, get to have a really good mentorship from them and learn from them, and they can challenge you and push you and stick up for you to get opportunities. This season, I got to co-edit an episode of Animal Kingdom because Ian, pushed for me to be able to do that. So that was, really great opportunity that I had. And that wouldn't happen in the same kind of way in reality. In reality, it's a lot of next man up, where it's like, oh, someone leaves, and I guess let's put someone else into that role. Whereas there's a lot more, I think in scripted, there's a lot more pressure put on everybody. Whether that's deserved or not is a different question, but that's kind of how the industry treats things. So that's kind of like, I learned how to use the software in reality, and I learned how to be in the room in scripted.
And when you say troubleshooting, are you saying that there's no workflow memo, there's no discussion about formats and how they flow from production through post?
There are and there aren't. And it's like, I think one of the benefits of reality is that it can be very flexible. And again, I haven't been in reality since 2016. So, things could be very different now. But when I was in reality, it was like always things were like a guide rather than like a hard and set rule, or like we're going to strictly follow this kind of thing. And that may have just been on the shows I worked on, but I know from a lot of different friends that that's not just my experience.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm sure. And Ian, do you mind speaking a little bit about your experience with reality TV, that is?
Sure, yeah. I would, for the most part, my experiences were very similar to Chris. I obviously was on the scene much sooner before he got there, so things were a little bit different. But the only thing I would add or at least piggyback on what Chris was saying, was just regarding the relationship between, I guess, the assistant editor and the editor. For a lot of the shows that I worked, I was maybe one of two, if not the only assistant working for 5 or 6 editors at a time. So aside from having to fix what was broken, you're also juggling a lot of different tasks and trying to keep everyone happy. Everybody wants their stuff to be taken care of, but a lot of it was prioritizing, well, whose stuff gets taken care of first over who asked first, and a lot of times that would cause some degree of conflict. And so, even though like in scripted, we talk about learning the politics of the room, I think in the reality TV world, the unscripted world, there's also a lot of politics in terms of managing a lot of people, or even within this, like if you have like multiple assistants, it's a lot of politics of making sure they're happy, especially if you're like day shift and then they're night shift. And if something bad happens during the day, you got to let them know at night, or else they'll get upset and vice versa. So thankfully, don't have to worry about that as much in scripted, but if you're the only assistant in scripted, it all kind of falls on your plate. So it's a different bag.
That's a good point, Ian, that I kind of forgot about. That I think besides troubleshooting, prioritization was one of the biggest skills I took away from being an assistant in reality, because sometimes I was working on a show, but for the majority of my time in reality, I was a staff assistant at a post house, or then I was an online editor at a post house. And so you're going to get bombarded with a lot of different clients seeing a lot of different things, and they all think their thing is the most important, and they all are the most important, but you can't do everything at once. So either as the only assistant, or when like I was the lead assistant editor for a while before I made the jump to online editor, being able to prioritize and delegate, like, okay, this person needs to do that thing, so because we need to get that done in time. And as you do the work, you start to learn, like, these are how long these things take. These are what I can accept. These are the things I can automate better. And, one of the cool things about posts is I think that there's always a level desire to innovate. And that's something that happens, I think, a lot more in reality, more quickly, willing to try the new innovations and technologies, because the timetable is different and their budgets are smaller. So they're trying different things to make it better. Whereas scripted can be more of like this, a giant machine that you're trying to shift in a different direction. It's hard to do. So sometimes the innovation is slower in scripted because of that. Avid's had a new version since 2019 that most shows I know are still using the 2018 version or before, because that's what people are comfortable with and know works. But yeah, it's a lot of figuring out what your skills are, how you can do your skills properly in the time period allotted, and also being able to communicate whether you can't, because sometimes that's the hardest part, is being like, I know this is what you want, but literally the machines can't do that thing you want that fast. So and being able to talk to either a supervisor or a client in a professional way, be like, I understand this is what you're looking for, we just can't do that. Not exactly the same thing, but piggybacking off of that, there was one of the heads of the company I worked for a while. There was one time where I'm very grateful that most of the mistakes I made in reality, I caught before they affected somebody. But one time, I made a mistake that, affected some stuff. And the lesson I learned in this instance was, like, I immediately went to like my lead editor and was like, this is what happened. I'm sorry it happened. We're doing this to fix it. And he was like, great. I saw he was mad. And as soon as I told him that, he's like, okay, cool, go do it. And if I try to make an excuse or try to blame someone or try to say it wasn't my fault, that would have been bad. Like, that wouldn't have gone over well. But because I took responsibility for it and had a game plan of how to fix it, he forgave me. And I think that's a thing that a lot of people will experience. And I think that's important to to take to heart early is that it's really scary when you mess up, but don't lie about it. Make people aware of it as soon as possible, because it's way worse if you try to cover it up and it affects something bad down the line, or you don't mention it because you don't want it to come back to you, and it always will get back to you. So be upfront right away when something goes wrong.
Chris, I'm so glad you mentioned that. That is $1 million advice right there. And during all these seminars, I've been sort of waiting for this to come up. And as Chris was mentioning, and about there's a giant machine. The company is a giant machine, and it's working on a schedule, and it's moving forward, and it relies on all of the different cogs in the wheel to be turning and producing. And when one of those things gets tripped up, everyone needs to know about it. And with that knowledge, they can make adjustments or help to fix it or whatever. So it's always better to own up to the situation, even if you may not have a solution to it. But Chris was skillful enough that he had an idea on how to approach it. But with or without that solution, telling your boss that this is happening is the most important thing. And we like to talk about how we get into the business and how we stay in the business, and that's one way to stay in the business. Because if you get to be known as the person who makes a mistake and try to point the finger at someone else, or doesn't tell you, and then lets your boss get caught with the problem, that's a disaster. One other thing inherent in the names scripted television, unscripted television, is what's guiding the story. And I think with the scripted television, obviously we know what the story is, but in reality, a story is evolving. And so is there anything to discuss about who's shaping that story, how the story sort of gels as you guys are getting the footage into the cutting room?
When I was still doing reality TV, there was a team of story producers who were essentially responsible for I guess crafting the overall shape of the episode and which direction it was going to go into. Like all other shows, I mean, reality TV has a lot of moving parts also. And there's one team of vloggers who are just essentially, they watch all the footage from beginning to end, every single take, every single second, and they notate if there's like any kind of interesting story point. And these story producers essentially go in and they go through all these story points, and they think to themselves, okay, like what kind of story can we craft from all this? So as an editor, I mean, you usually work very, very closely with these story producers to kind of shape the overall story of the episode, or even like the series arc, if you want to call it that. So they work hand in hand. The story producers, they create a rough outline of what's going to happen, where all the story points are and footage, and then the editors work off that and put it together and use existing footage to help accentuate those points and really drive the story home.
I see.
Or there could be transcripts from interviews, especially in like more the doc world, which is not something I have a ton of familiar with, but I have friends in it. They have all these interviews and they get it all transcribed, and so they might be going through the transcription of the interviews and kind of seeing from a text space, oh, that storyline kind of goes through here. If I pull that and pull that and pull that, and I can string it together with this footage, it kind of starts you on a place. And often in docs and in reality, there's a construction called a radio edit, where you tell the audio story that you're trying to tell. What's the storyline that's happening that someone's basically narrating, either through the footage itself, like the reality footage, or through talking head interview footage. And then it's the editor's job to, after that's kind of assembled, how do we make that look and feel good by putting in good B-roll or cutting away to reactions, etc. How do we, or archival footage, if it's show that's going to deal with a lot of that. So radio edit's a big part of working in reality or unscripted.
Mm-hmm. And I know the Bay Area Video Coalition also has some focus on documentary filmmakers. Ian or Chris, have you had much experience in documentary?
Unfortunately, no. I think
Okay.
reality TV was about as close as I got to it.
Got it. Any other notes you might pass on, Chris, to budding documentary filmmakers?
Um, I haven't worked with a ton in docs, but I will say that based on conversations with friends and other people I know who work with docs, it's like if you're going to work in docs, pick a subject you're really interested in, because docs are a lot of work, usually with very little to no pay for a long periods of time. So if you're going to do a doc, do something you're really passionate about and you want to tell that story, because you're probably going to be doing it more for the love of it than making money about with it.
Right,
so.
right. Well, speaking of making money, you during the segue to reality TV, you mentioned the Writers Guild strike. That refers, yeah, Chris was referring to the 2008 coincidence of the Writers Guild of America going on strike right about the time the entire country was shutting down in what's now known as the Great Recession. What happened was the writers stopped writing movies, TV shows, and put a lot of people out of work, as all of the guilds and unions rely on each other's works to keep the industry moving. And because there was no scripts, that's when unscripted television made a giant leap forward in programming, the number of hours programmed, and just the innovation in that whole approach. So if you don't mind, what I'd like to talk a little bit about is how you two enter the unions, and how someone might do that today. Chris?
Sure. It isn't an easy thing. That's kind of an unfortunate thing, is that especially on the West Coast. And on the East Coast, it's a little different, because, or at least in terms of the Editors Guild, because the Editors Guild is a bi-coastal local union, which is kind of weird. But so they have different rules. But in the West Coast, you have to get a certain amount of days you've worked in post-production, whether it be and credited for that work, whether it be like an editor or an assistant editor, and you have to have like a supervisor sign off on that, and you have to accrue, I think it's something like 300 days as an editor and 200 days as an assistant over a 2 or 3 year period. And then that just gets you on a list called the industry experience roster, which is a separate entity from IATSE, which is the big overall union guild, where all the guilds are a part of. But the industry experience roster is a third party thing where basically they verify that people have worked the amount of days or hours they're supposed to in order to qualify to be a part of the union. Now, it does require a lot of work to get on that roster, and then you have to get it verified, and that's kind of where it becomes hard for people. And literally in my experience, I had all the days, but I was afraid to ask my boss to sign off on it, because then I would be letting him know, hey, I'm interested in leaving eventually to work in scripted. And I eventually did ask him to sign it. He was like cool with it. And then the first instance we had like, kind of a little dry spell in the company, I was let go because, I want to work in scripted, so I can go try to do that now. So, so it's hard. It's one of the things about joining the union is that there's a lot of steps and bureaucracy that you have to deal with, that it makes it really hard for people to it just creates a lot of unnecessary barriers to entry, I feel like. And it kind of funnels people into like, if you're an affluent straight white male, it's a lot easier of a path than if you're a lot of different other people, and I think that what I would love to see the industry changes to kind of break down some of those barriers, so that we are not just making it so you have to go this certain path. Like, it keeps a lot of talented people out of jobs that could be doing those jobs if we didn't have to go through these arbitrary ways of doing it. Anyway, that's a little bit of a rant.
That's fine. And you're absolutely right that you know, there are those folks who are somehow more accepted into the path than others, and you know, hopefully we're trying to break that down. Ian, what was your experience joining the union? What is your experience being in the union? Any comments on how to get in the union, or the what's good and bad about a union?
Okay, well, I guess we'll start with the good of joining the union. I guess for those who haven't heard about the union before, the union is essentially what guarantees, you know, your pay rate and also qualifies you for health benefits and whatnot. Most scripted shows that you see on television and in feature films, if they want to qualify for any type of award, have to be union. So that's why there's always like such a push to work for, you know, to get into the union and whatnot. I think some reality TV and unscripted shows are union, but for largely, I think commercials and low budget features and reality TV, they're all non-union. So your rate is not always guaranteed, and you certainly don't have access to health benefits that a lot of other union folks do. That's the good. I think the bad part of it is, you know, like Chris said, I mean, there's a certain degree of there's a certain barrier of entry. It's not the easiest thing to get into. And even once you're in the union, you're paying your dues, but it doesn't mean you're guaranteed a job, at least not anymore. I think a long time ago when unions first started, it kind of guaranteed your work, but I think the days are long gone since when they actively find you work and place you, you know, in those opportunities. That being said, I mean, I would strongly recommend trying to get into the union because I happen to like getting paid a certain amount of money. I also enjoy, you know, again, the health benefits. For me, I mean, for those looking to get into the editors union, there's a lot of ways you can get into it. You just have to qualify in a particular position for a certain number of days. It's been so long, I've forgotten what the exact numbers are now. There's a certain number of hours, right?
I think it's days.
Days. Okay, and you need pay stubs with your job title.
Or a supervisor to sign off on it if your picture doesn't have your job title, which is the situation I was in.
Right. So there's a number of positions you can get in. You can be an assistant editor on reality TV. That's usually the most common way to do it, which is, you know, one of the reasons why Chris and I started out in reality TV and we were able to make that jump to scripted, is because of how, you know, that's how a lot of folks get their hours. I actually got my hours working in the film vault at the photochem processing facility. Yeah, so you can actually qualify by working in a film vault. Most film vaults, well, I don't even know if they really have them anymore. I mean, back in the day when there was like a lot of stuff that was still on video cassette. It was just essentially a large room with video cassettes, and you were just librarian, and you would just check tapes in and out, and you just have to work in that position for however many days to be in the union. The film vault I worked in was a very large vault with lots of big film reels, and it was a lot of physical labor. And I toughed it out until I was able to get the hours to do it, and you know, quickly left that situation shortly after to try to get into like an actual assistant editor job and position. So once I got my hours, I brought it to the third-party roster company that Chris was referring to, and waited until the CSI was willing to hire me, and that's how I got into the union.
They still do have vaults. They're just all hard drives now.
Okay.
And occasionally, like some shows will still shoot on like digital tape, and they'll go into there as well. But usually, it's just larger with the hard drives now instead of reels.
Right. So in order to get in the union, you also need to, I guess, pay an initiation fee and then dues on top of that. However, if you are on a non-union show and it goes union while you're on it, I think you get grandfathered into the union without having to pay all the extra money or do the full hourly requirements or daily requirements to meet that.
I will say one thing. my own experience versus Ian's in terms of, I would recommend anybody who wants to work in scripted join the roster as soon as possible, but not necessarily join the union, simply for the fact that unless you're actively working on a union show, you don't get any benefits. You're only paying dues. So you want to basically be union ready, so you're on the roster, but not join until you have a union gig to do so. So, and part of the reason, the frustration with the roster, is that there are a lot of things that the roster just doesn't count. So, when I was getting on the roster, I was working on mostly airing television shows, so that was really easy for my hours to count. But I had friends who were working in a lot of like web stuff, doing the same type of work, doing this, having the same skills, but their hours were not deemed worthy based on the experience because the industry didn't feel like they counted. And that's kind of one of the frustration parts, that there's this democratization of technology, and there's so many ways people can do the work and learn the job and learn the skills and be able to do the job, but we're still kind of narrow-minded and like, what makes you qualified to do that, and that's one of the frustrations about joining the union.
Right. To just a little bit of perspective on the different terminology, we talked about the Writers Guild, and then we also talk about unions. From my understanding, the guild is there to protect the craft, and the union is there to protect the worker. And to sort of give the idea of why they have these requirements, the union is trying to establish that each individual has a certain level of skill set to be able to satisfy the responsibilities required by union work. And that's how they come to the idea of have you needing to have a certain number of days or hours in that field to get your union card. We have a very good question in the chat. Can you share about the differences in deadlines when working on reality TV shows versus scripted? How does the pace differ during post on each show?
I was literally
Chris,
talking about this with Ian the other day, just like the differences, because the deadline or the pipeline in reality can be so incredibly fast. When I was working at a post house as an online editor, which is another name for basically the editor who does all the finishing. Once it's locked, once the episode has been basically constructed and it's good as is, then there's an editor who basically conforms it to the standards of the network it's delivering to, and often does color, etc., does reviews with the post supervisor, and then creates the final outputs that will go to the network, and then handles any QC fixes if there are issues or quality control fixes that come up from the network when they check it. When I was in reality, I was often delivering, episodes, maybe a week, but often a couple of days before they aired. Whereas in scripted, it's usually a much longer pipeline. Like, for instance, Ian and I are working on Animal Kingdom season 6 now, but season 5 hasn't aired yet. And we finished those episodes several months ago. I know on Netflix, scripted shows have an incredibly long QC process where you deliver the show, but you have to deliver it so early based on your air date, because they have a very involved QC process that also is involved in like international deliveries, etc. When Ian and I worked on Lovecraft Country for HBO, we had to have 4 months between, but on paper at least, 4 months between when we locked an episode and when final VFX were delivered. And then once final VFX were delivered, it was still like a couple weeks, a week or so before we delivered the episode, because you still had to go through mixing, etc., and all these things. So scripted, there's a lot more time to basically get it right. Whereas reality, it's kind of like you just got to go until you can't anymore, and then it's shove it out the door.
Ian, any comment?
Again, it's been a while since I've actually been in reality. It's been over, 10 years. And so I'm sure the process has changed to a certain degree. But I do remember it being kind of fast and furious. At the time I was the last reality TV show I worked on was America's Next Top Model, which a lot of people really, really enjoyed. And I think they had decided, instead of just doing one cycle, as they call them, per year. They went to 2. And I very, very, I remember very, very clearly trying to finish one cycle and having just no room left on the server for more footage. And like another week's worth of footage came in, and trying to figure out how I was going to get the editors to work and keep going. You know, what just keeping all the turbines, I guess, pumping, you know, to keep the show moving.
I will say that I did work on a show where, you know, I can't remember, but like we were airing 8 p.m. on Friday night, and the episode began, and the post producer was literally had to carry that last reel to the broadcast station in order to get it the ending on the air. So it does happen in scripted as well.
So stressful.
When I was working on like the MTV Movie Awards and the VMAs, what would happen is we would basically be at our facility ready, and as the show was airing, they would break tape at certain increments in the show, and then they would ship those, or basically a PA would drive them to us, and we would start digitizing, because, you know, yes, the show is airing live, but we have to in 24 hours we basically have to re-air it in a cut down version to time, so that it doesn't run over any commercial breaks, so the network can get the money that they are owed for commercials. So we would be digitizing, and then the editors would, you know, at 8 o'clock the show would start, and like 9 or 9:30 we might start getting tapes, and midnight the editors would show up, and then we would go all night cutting down the show, and by like, you know, hopefully by noon we were ready, and then I would go on a drive or a tape to a PA would drive it to somewhere else, and they would satellite it to New York, and like then we went home and slept.
Yeah. And I'm sure there are times when you guys have been working 7 days a week and crazy long hours and all that.
Thankfully, in my union scripted jobs, and that's one of the benefits of the union, you have these protections, so that, you know, when you work overtime, you get paid overtime, and, you know, you have to get, you know, it approved ahead of time, so you don't do the work unless it's approved. Whereas in reality, there's not as many of those protections, so you kind of are expected to maybe kill yourself more, which isn't something anyone should be doing.
Right.
But it's hard, you know, it's a hard thing we have to navigate.
Right. Any questions? Thank you very much for the questions that have come up. If anybody has any questions, or what I would like to do right now is transition to the practical side of Chris and Ian's work. If you guys wouldn't mind just taking it literally from the beginning to the end of an episode's arc, from getting the script, reading it. I'm not sure what sort of breakdown you guys might do at that point, the tone meeting, to receiving those first dailies, etc. I'm going to step away just for a moment, and I'll be right back. If you guys wouldn't mind taking it away.
Sure. So I guess for this segment, I guess Chris and I can tag team. You know, Chris, please feel free to interject whenever you have anything to add.
Well, I guess before we do that, let's just clarify our roles better, because I think we haven't really done that. You know, we said that I'm an assistant editor and that Ian's an editor, but what does that mean? You know, and the editor is the person who you think of when you think of editing, is the person who puts the pieces together, who cuts out the bad bits and puts in all the good bits and arranges them and makes a beautiful story. The assistant editor is the person that helps that process happen by doing a lot of technical stuff, like getting all the footage from whatever source it's coming from, whether that's if you're actually getting the raw files themselves, or if it's going and scripted, it usually goes to a post house who colors it, syncs it to sound, organizes it, and gets it into an editable format so that you just get it and you're ready to go. That's what happens on our shows and every scripted show I've worked on. So then as assistant editor, I will organize that footage in the way that Ian likes it to be cut, so that he can cut easily. And every editor is different. So every editor I've worked with has me organize it in a slightly different way. Ian is one of the easiest editors to work with in terms of organization. So I'm very grateful that we've worked so long together, because I have other friends who have to do a lot more involved things, and Ian's a lot simpler. But then I'll also help with doing temp sound when Ian has finished the cuts on a scene. So I'll put in backgrounds and add any hard sounds to basically sell the story more. And that's all temp footage because eventually it's going to go to a sound team to do it. But in our current world, like we basically, our producers, directors, networks and studios want to see it as close to the final as possible. So we really have to do a lot of work in the edit to sell that. And back in the day, the jobs were kind of different where like editor literally just cut picture and then they knew it would sound good eventually. And that's not really where we are anymore. We had to really sell it. But then I'll also do the outputs that will go to the different people, whether it be directors or producers, etc. And then once the episode is locked, I do a bunch of deliverables that'll send it to people where they can do the final sound, VFX, color, whatever, etc. So that's just the difference between assistant editor and editor. And now we can go from like the process.
Okay, thanks. Just one thing to I guess recap what Chris said. I mean, the number one thing that an assistant do for the editor is just make sure that the editor can keep cutting and doing what he's doing. You know, the way I like to see it, I mean, like if the editor is kind of like, you know, the brains and the hands of the whole thing, I mean, the assistant is really the heart and the circulatory system pumping the blood to the editor so the editor can keep doing what he's doing. So that being said, I mean, you can see why, especially in the scripted world, the relationship between an editor and the assistant is like sacred. You know, you guys, if you've worked with a really good assistant for a long time or a really good editor for a long time, there's a certain shorthand that you guys share, almost like a hive mind. You already know like what's needed of the other and what the other thinking and like what to expect, that sort of thing. So good communication is key, but I think like after a while, they're almost like work spouses. I don't know if Chris feels the same way, but we've been working together long enough. And
Yeah.
You know.
I mean, Ian could leave a marker on a clip that says like something very brief, and I'm like, oh, I know exactly what he means by that, and I'll do the thing. Or, you know, sometimes we don't even have to say anything; it's just expected. You know, if I do this, he does that, etc. So,
right.
It really it is just like a really high functioning machine, I guess.
Symbiosis.
Yeah, there we go.
There you go. Okay, so I guess starting from the episode, I guess what happens first is I will get a script of the episode in the email, and well, as with Chris, we will both get a copy of the script. If we're diligent, of course, then we would read the script at least once before beginning it. I always read the script. And then there's usually a tone meeting involving the director or the writer or writers and maybe a producer at most. And we go over each scene. We talk about the key story points of each scene and what the overall tone of the actors is supposed to be. I mean, it kind of shapes the pace and the general feel of what we're trying to convey. And I guess from an editor's viewpoint, for me, this is where I really kind of pay attention to what the key story points are for the episode, so that when I watch the scene and I get the footage in the dailies, I know exactly which pieces of footage I'm going to use or to look for before we even start. So that's the tone meeting, and then they start shooting. Have I missed anything, Chris? I think we're good so far.
So something that I have to deal with that Ian doesn't in terms of the prep is that once they have decided what the schedule is for the shoot, we get something called a one-liner, which is basically a one-line description of the scenes in the order that they plan on shooting everything. Once that document is emailed to everybody, I take that and I basically construct a schedule for when we're going to be getting the dailies. Not everybody does this, but I find it really helpful in terms of being able to know that I've gotten everything I'm supposed to. And I basically have a checklist of like, these are all the scenes that are happening. I use a website called Trello, which basically is like kind of like a tack board or a whiteboard that you basically can virtually put stuff on. So you basically can create lists and then you create cards. So I basically create a card for every scene and I gave it a due date of the day I'm supposed to receive those dailies. And then I also have that related to all the days are related together, and it basically, and then as we see everything in one, see what things are still outstanding, what things may have changed, what things, because you can assign labels that are all colored differently so that you can kind of see everything at a glance. Some people use Trello like you would use like when you would break down a script or break down scenes, where you can see all the scenes at once on a board, physically in a physical space in front of you. Trello is kind of like that, but virtually. And when we get all the paperwork that comes with the dailies, where we get things called the scripted pages and the facing pages, line script and facing pages, which is basically noted up by the script pages, noted up by the scriptee or the script supervisor, also related to the edit log, which is a description of what the takes are, etc. What I do for Ian is I sub those out per scene and then attach those to each scene card. So if Ian has a question about an episode or a scene that he's cutting, he can go to the Trello board, click on that scene, and then see the paperwork instantly for just the thing he's looking at. So yeah, that's a little prep work that I do when we start getting stuff.
So keep in mind that Chris does all this behind the scenes. And so I just like waltzed in the morning and I sit down and I check Trello to see what's up. And I'm like, oh, the magic Trello fairies have laid this out for me. How great is that? Hey, Chris, you should do what they do. So that's just the beginning of prep. So I guess they start shooting, and they shoot for most episodic television that I've worked on. They shoot anywhere between 7 and 9 days. I think the most we had was like 11 once, Chris, was it? Lovecraft Country was.
I mean, Lovecraft Country was a different beast because we got like 20 shooting days at one, per episode. Okay. In Animal Kingdom, the most we've ever had in a normal production schedule was 9, because it was a John Wells episode. Who John Wells was directing, so he got an extra day.
Don't we still owe a little bit on 602?
I think something's being shot for 602 tomorrow or something, maybe.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. I mean, we've had 20 days worth of shooting for 601 on this season, but it part of that was because they cross-boarded it, which, for the people who don't know, cross-boarding is when you shoot multiple episodes at once, and it's usually in a normal production schedule. You shoot one episode all in a row. It's obviously shot out of order based on locations, etc., but you're only focusing on one episode. When you cross-board episodes, you're shooting multiple episodes at once. So like one day it could be all of 601, next day 601 and 602, 601 being season 6, episode 1. And then maybe the next day is all 603. So on this season of Animal Kingdom, they shot 601 and 602 cross-boarded. So they shot for like longer, but we were getting footage for every episode every day.
And some of the reasons that productions do that are if we have locations that are far apart that play in 2 episodes, that way we can travel the company a long way and shoot a bulk of work, like a full day's work or 2 days work on a couple episodes, and then move on to the next location. Or we might be doing different time periods where certain sets play in both a past period and a present period and or a future period, and there's time needed to change those sets over. And so that's part of the reason why we might block shoot. And does that cause you any issues, Chris, or that just sort of expands the scheduling?
I don't think it causes issues. It's just you have to keep track of more things at once. I try to keep things very separated. So it's just like it's not like double work, but it's like doing 1.5 times work, because it's like double checking everything. Usually when you cross-board, you're only doing one episode. For us, we did both 1 and 2. So we were working on both episodes. So that was a little bit more of a logistical challenge, because we're trying to keep up to camera. And by keeping up to camera, meaning we are cutting basically by the end of the day, we're close to having cut all the scenes we received that day. And so when you're doing 2 episodes at once, that can be a challenge, but we made it.
I will say, like, from an editing standpoint, cross-boarding does get a little confusing in terms of just the narrative, because sometimes I forget which episode this scene belongs to versus that one. And like I was saying, like in part of the prep work, when you read the scripts, you kind of keep track of what the narrative threads are. And it might be a lot more present in one than the other. So it does color the way you interpret the footage when you get it.
And did you cut 1 and 2, Ian?
Yes.
And so you cut both episodes?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And how often does it come up when multiple editors work on the same episode? Like somebody will cut one scene and somebody will cut another scene? Does that ever happen?
Yes, certainly. At least in my experience, I think there's a few scenarios in which that happens. One, if it's like a very big episode and they want to try a lot of different things in a very, very short amount of time, they'll have multiple editors working on it, so they can see different versions of the same scene, or just work on segments and create different versions of the same segment, just to be able to compare and contrast, that sort of thing. I've also seen the unfortunate scenario where an editor has let go in the beginning of an episode or in the middle or somewhere along the way, and another editor takes over to address it as well. So I think those are the two most common ones I've seen. But there's a million other reasons why. Sometimes people, some editors like to work in teams, and maybe some producers like certain combinations of editors that work together and say like, okay, you guys, tackle this. In the case of episode five, right, Chris? Chris and I co-edited that one together. So that was, that was an opportunity for him to bust out of his assistant editing role and take a seat in the editor's chair as well. Fantastic.
And then when multiple editors work on the same episode, is there any distinction in style? Does each editor must have a different perspective, a different approach? Is that visible? Do you have to shape that? And also, how, as you move between the shows, how do you adjust to each show's style?
That's a very good question. I do think that all editors have a particular style. And I think if you watch the same editor enough, you notice the way they approach certain scenes. Having said that, it is often challenging also to see the difference in styles, because editors work with the footage they're given, and the footage is shot by a director, and each director has their own style and specific, thumbprint. So, it's really kind of hard to tell unless, you have a certain, certain repeat directors and certain repeat editors on the same show. Then you can see the differences in the style from show to show. But I think that sort of thing is definitely for like film buffs who really, really like to dig into the nuts and bolts of editing. So you can see the difference in style. In terms of carrying it from episode to episode, that's one of the jobs of the producers and the creative head, to make sure that even though each episode may be cut a little bit differently, it still falls within the, I guess, the boundaries of what the show's style and aesthetic is.
How do you, well, I'll hold that question. Just to get back a little bit to those nuts and bolts, let's talk a little bit about script notes. What are script notes? What are they? What do they try to explain and delineate? And how do you rely on them?
Chris, you want to take this one, or shall I?
I mean, I think we both use them for different things. So I use them to basically make sure that I have everything that was shot in the system, because sometimes you might be missing something. So the first thing I do every morning once I get my dailies is I go off the script notes. There's the edit log and the sound reports and the camera reports, and I verify that everything that I receive from the dailies house is also what I should have got based on this on the script notes. So it's going to tell you the order they shot it in, what cameras were for what setup, etc. A description of that. I don't as much care about the description of things. I'm literally just checking, do we have this? Do we have this? With this? Yes. And then we might have notes from our dailies house, and we get an email every morning, basically like, were there any issues or were there not? Usually they're not, but sometimes they might let us know like, oh, there was this sound roll was missing, so we don't have this footage yet, so we'll get it to you later, etc. That's how I use script notes. Ian, might use them differently because he's actually using them to gauge like what the director wants. If like the script, he's like, this is the take the director wanted.
Yeah, that's definitely very, very helpful. In terms of getting into the editing of it, you know, once I get the footage for the scene, I always reference the script notes to see if there was anything that the director specifically liked. Sometimes there'll be a comment from the script supervisor, which take to use, or which take the director preferred, or if there's just a take that the director absolutely does not like and does not want us to use, that's in there also. And you know, sometimes the script supervisor will also indicate, you know, when lines were dropped or reversed, or you know, lines of dialogues are changed, or you know, if the actors were having certain degrees of difficulty in terms of getting the line out, and they had to call an audible and change the lines up a little bit. The script supervisor always notates that. So those are the things I look for, because it saves me a lot of time when I'm assembling it to make sure I got the right pieces in there. So we're not wasting any time on the back end, you know, putting in what the director or the producer actually wanted.
And Chris, when you say you check the notes to make sure you're getting everything you are expecting to get, are you talking about complete scenes, or are you talking about particular shots, or sound and picture? What are you talking about?
It's basically there's going to be the list of this shot. These are the setups we shot. You know, we shot 31, setup 31, A and B cam, and then 31A, A and B cam, and 31B only B cam. So that'll be on the edit log, and then I'll look at the bin I got from the Daly's house and say, all right, so I have 31A and B, takes 1 and 2, etc. And I'm just checking what's on the edit log. I have in the Avid. So every individual piece, basically, because I want to make sure that Ian has everything. Because the worst thing that could happen for an assistant preparing dailies is that he or she does not, or they don't deliver what everything there, so that maybe your editor starts cutting and he doesn't have an important piece, and then you get to the director's cut, and the director's like, where's this take? This was clearly my most favorite take, and you should have seen it in the footage. And the editor might be like, I've never seen that before, and it's because the editor didn't have it, or the assistant editor didn't flag that it was missing. So, you know, and the thing is, it's a bunch of people have done this process, because the Daly's house checks all their stuff when they get it before they make their deliverables for us. So I pretty much expect it to be right every time, but I'm also still going to check to make sure everything is there.
Okay. So let's say you read the script, you had the tone meeting, they shot the first day. You got the film break and the film drop from the night before. Chris with the has logged it all in, put it on a card. Ian walks in, grabs a cup of coffee, sits down at the Avid, and starts to cut. Now, how do you begin the assembly?
Well, first things first, usually when I sit down, I take a look at what scenes had been shot the day before. And I prioritize my workload based on that. Usually, I will tackle the biggest and heftiest scene first, just because my brain is still fresh and minty. And you know, that's where you want to expend the bulk of your effort, because if you spend your first half a day or so working on the little scenes and be like, oh, great, you know, I only have one scene left, and then this mammoth 5-page scene, you know, with a lot of different people and reactions, a lot going on, you're going to burn out really fast, and you're not going to be able to put a good assembly together. So first things first, I always check to see which was the biggest scene. The next thing I do is I open up my bin, which has all my footage in it, check all the different takes and everything. And that's usually when I'll reference the script notes, and I'll take a look at and see what all the circled takes, which are the preferred director's takes, are. I'll see if there's any notes or things that he doesn't want me to use, or things that he really, really strongly wants me to use. I'll look for those things first, so I keep it in the back of my mind. So when I start watching the footage, I know what to flag. So when I do start assembling footage, I know which pieces to grab and put together. That being said, I read the script, or I read the script for the scene again, just to make sure I understand what the scene is about. I think about what the overall arc of the scene is, who's, and this is critical, point of view, whose point of view the scene is supposed to be from, because all these things will dictate the shape of your assembly is going to determine what shots you end up using. And you always look for pieces that serve the story. So that's when I start watching the footage. And the great thing about Animal Kingdom is it's got a very good stable of seasoned directors, so they always know what to shoot, and they cover it very, very well. But even with that, I mean, it's still a tremendous amount of footage to go through. But watching the footage, if you've done your homework and you figured out which take the director wants to use and what the story beats are, you're able to grab the pieces pretty quickly. So once you start assembling, once you finish watching the footage, you have a very, very strong idea of what the scene is supposed to look like once you start assembling it.
I see. And then you mentioned point of view, which I think is a really good thing to bring up. I think a lot of shows more and more are told from a character's perspective, and I think that comes across, I think, subliminally for much of the audience. Can you describe how that is translated and how you might affect that?
Certainly. I think one of the joys of just film making is being able to put someone else into someone else's shoes. That's the beauty of it. And I think that's the most captivating part about, I think the most captivating and successful movies on television are able to transport a viewer into a different time and place and even different body. And I think, with a lot of these new shows that you were referencing, I think that's what they strive to do. So, of course, when you get your footage, of course, you're going to get a few shots that are very, very just information based. Usually like a wide shot or anything. It just tells you the geography and who the characters are and things like that. But then you get into things like close-ups, which are a lot better in terms of conveying a character's emotions and that sort of thing. So depending on how you assemble the footage, and this is where this is the bread and butter from editor. Depending on how you assemble the footage, you will shape what this character sees in the scene, or how this character interacts with this little world that he or she is or they have been placed in. And it can go from, and this is why the tone meeting is so important, because it informs you what the character is supposed to be thinking, what the character is supposed to be experiencing, and what are they going through in the scene, what's the point of the scene essentially. So editing, depending on which shot you use, the pace of it, the rhythm of it, it tells you what the character is feeling. Is it fast and frenetic? Is it calm? There's a lot of latitude you can to play with there.
Somebody much smarter than me recently mentioned the audience only knows what we tell them, and the editing room is often that final step about shaping what message is actually delivered. And so, if, say, you have a reaction. A character reacting to the main character, and if showing that reaction might then shine a new light on the main character's performance and how they're feeling. So when Ian mentions choosing those shots, it can be crucial in guiding the story and shaping character arc.
Ian talks a lot about POV, and so much so that I have right here these 3 blue Post-its all say POV, so that I can remember that when I cut scenes. Yes. Because that's something that Ian really introduced me to, that, and kind of is someone who, when I do cut scenes, not just in my episode that I co-edited, but thankfully Ian allows me to cut several scenes per episode as a way to continue to grow my craft. That's something he's always like, okay, great. Well, whose POV is this scene? We need, remember, this scene has to be about Jay, or this scene is about Craig versus Darren, etc. And so that's something that I just, I keep that there so that I remember that when I'm cutting.
And when we say POV, we're not talking a literal point of view where the camera is the actor's eyes, but rather whose perspective the story is being told from.
It's the emotional perspective.
Right.
Correct.
And Ian and Chris, I know we've got that scene, so whenever you feel like is an appropriate time in this discussion to show that scene, please feel free to bring that up.
Certainly.
In the meantime, we have a question from someone when you are editing or new to editing softwares like Premiere, what are best practices to keep in mind when you are learning?
I would say just try different things. I think one of the great takeaways for me from reality TV is working with other assistant editors is that, I mean, you're going to discover that not one person knows everything unless they're just some kind of savant. There's always something new, like to learn, a new trick or whatnot. So learn the fundamentals and learn the basics, but talk with other people who are working with the same platform that you're working with, and you'll find out that there's a lot of things you don't know how to do that they know how to do. That's really cool, and vice versa. And then you just kind of trade secrets along the way. I will say that I've learned a lot of the Avid from Chris. I've stolen so much of his stuff. So yeah.
Well, that's could be one of the things about going from assisting to editing, is that editing is kind of like, your skills are how you edit, not necessarily like how you're using the app. I mean, that comes into play, but not as much. Whereas the assistant has to be more technical, so they might be more on top of the technical limitations or benefits of how any software works. So unless you're a person who just really likes to be on top of like all the recent innovations technologically speaking, editors can be like, all right, well, I know that how the system works and I'm just going to keep using it that way. And there's nothing wrong with that. But sometimes you might, basically get stuck at your knowledge level of how the software works when you got to editing. So sometimes assistants have to encourage their editors to try new things.
And I think, it's important to learn the basic fundamentals of just editing 101, about, as Ian was saying, the wide shot, cut to the close-up, cut to the oppositional close-up, then cut to a tighter shot, etc. Learn the rules and then maybe break them and try something new, and find out what works, what doesn't work. See if you can figure out why it doesn't work. Chris, any notes?
Yeah, and this is not so much necessarily about if you're learning a new software, but like if you're learning editing, like take a scene from a movie or a TV show that you really like that just speaks to you, and then just kind of break it down from an editing perspective. Like, ask yourself, why do I like this scene? And then kind of answer those questions. Well, I like this scene because I like this person's performance. Okay, what about the performance controlled through the editing? Oh, I got a reaction shot on this critical moment, and what their face did there told the story so much better, etc. Like, the great thing about filmmaking is that you can really read into pretty much everything and learn from it. So, it's so easy to get bogged down in learning the technology, but at the end of the day, the technology is not the thing that's going to get you the next job or keep you getting jobs. It's the soft skills that are the things that are going to keep you getting the work. So obviously learning software is important, but only in the extent of that. I think this is the point I was trying to, in my head, I've been trying to convey. Learn the software so that you can just do what you're thinking. But, if you're like, oh, I want to do this with the footage, just learn it so that you can be able to do that without having to struggle. At this point, Ian and I can just use the Avid where we're not thinking about like, oh, I have to do these things. We're just like, I'm going to do this thing. And your fingers start doing that. So that takes practice and that takes time, but I wouldn't get hung up on the individual's aspects of software as much.
Let's talk a little bit about problems that you might find in the cutting room, like crossing the line, continuity issues, sound frustrations. What drives you nuts the most?
I guess as an editor, I would say a scene that is just not properly covered well, meaning that I don't have the pieces that I need to construct the narrative, the emotional narrative, or the physical narrative that is taking place in the scene. That makes things very, very difficult for me. A lot of people talk about, like what makes great editing, and they're like, oh, it's all about just matching one shot to another. No, that's like 5% of it. Anybody can do a match cut, but it's all about how well he draws the emotion of the scene from the footage you have. I've worked up enough episodes now where I've had like a lot of great directors where like you have everything you need. Like, oh, it'd be really great if I could have a shot of this guy looking like this and turning into this, into this angle to show that, and voila, it's all there, But then there's a lot of other directors who are relatively new or inexperienced or complacent, and the footage a lot of times feel, for lack of a better word, just lazy. And you're left to wonder, well, how am I supposed to convey the emotion of this scene with just this one wide shot? That's the stuff that drives me nuts, because then it goes beyond editing. You're at this point, you're pulling rabbits out of hats to make things work. It's very frustrating because the producer knows like this is all the footage you have. It's too expensive to go back and reshoot it. So now it's on you and you alone to save the scene. And, I think any editor who's worth his weight in gold is able to perform that kind of alchemy, but it's not without a very large share of frustration and four-letter expletives.
Well, let's now take it back to the cutting sort of steps, where let's say you've got the scene cut. Now they shot 2, 3, 4 more days, and now the episode is starting to take shape. What do you do to prepare for the director's cut? Sometimes you have some conversations during shooting with the director about what sort of direction he or she might be wanting to take the scene in. Describe some of that, please. Sure.
So it's funny that you mentioned that, because I actually just spoke to the director of the episode we're working on just yesterday. And so, I think with every show, there's a stable of in-house directors that they regularly use, who know the show, know the style, know the aesthetic. Excuse me, I'm getting a spam call. Who know the show, the style, and the aesthetic, and they shoot according to those standards. But every so often you bring in a director from, like a guest director, as they call them, who brings in their own style and flavor. And so in those instances, I usually find it very, very helpful to understand like what they're trying to accomplish with the footage, because they always bring a little bit of a fresh take on it. So it's kind of good to get on the same page, because if you don't, then you end up just cutting the show as you've always cut it, and then the director comes and says, well, I wanted to try something different with this. It's a little bit different. So the kind of notes you usually receive are they like the use of certain camera angles in it, or favoring shots that are out of focus, or certain types of music, or certain tone or pacing. They want to cut it up more or slow it down with less cuts, that sort of thing. So it's very, very helpful, because it saves a lot of time before we actually get into the director's cut.
So you do your cut, maybe with some notes. The director finishes shooting, you finalize your cut, and then the director used to come into the cutting room. Now I suppose he or she's doing it by Zoom. And how is that? How would you describe that process now with the director's cut?
So once the director finishes shooting, then we are allowed usually depending on the show, you're allowed a few days to, I guess, get the show in order in the way that you as an editor would like to cut it. So you make all your cuts, you put all your music choices in there. A lot of this stuff I turn over to Chris for final sound design. He does he does like a temp sound design on it, and he cleans a lot of things up to me, so it's in a playable state for the director. So once the editor finishes his cut, then I give it over to Chris. He preps it and he sends it to the director. Now, like you said, back in the day, pre-pandemic, usually we would be in the office and the director would come in and sit in, and we'd go over the episode together, and he or she would instruct me to the changes they would like to make to the cut. And we would go through the show a number of times. I think the DGA requirement is 4 days, I think, that each director gets. 4
days.
Right, to make the changes that they would like to make on the cut. And so we go through each scene, and sometimes the process is very, very arduous. Sometimes like the director wants to take everything I've done, like completely change it into a different direction. And there's also been some instances where the director is very, very happy and only has 1 or 2 notes and says, like, you did a really great job. Let's show it like this. So it just depends on the personality of the director also.
I see. Chris, how would you, let's talk a little bit about that temp sound mix. What do you put into that?
So basically, as Ian finishes scenes, he will send them to me, and I will start doing my sound work on it. Basically, the first step for me is always just a dialogue pass, just making sure the dialogue is not legible, but hearable, audible, and consistent. You know, because sometimes based on, you know, generally in scripted television, you cut with the production mix because you're shooting and there's, you know, a bunch of actors are mic'd up, and there's also like the boom and everything, and so there's one mix track of everything, and the editors usually cut with that. But sometimes that might not be the best sounding track, so a lot of times I might have to go in and swap that out for maybe the actor's ISO mic track or whatever. And basically the first step is just making sure that all the like dialogue is in the best days it can be. Then I put in some backgrounds to make sure that you feel the environment that you're in, whether like if you're at a restaurant, you got to have some diner sounds, and so you're hearing the kitchen and the patrons, etc., to ground you in the reality. Or if I'm, you know, in Animal Kingdom, they're always at the Cody house outside at night at the pool, so like I have a consistent sound that I put in for all of those scenes. So it's got crickets and, you know, night sounds and everything. And then I go through and if there's any hard sounds, which basically are as actions happen, there need to be sounds for it, whether that could be like a punch or a kick if we're in a fight scene, or a gunshot, or maybe it's something, sometimes it's something much more amorphous, where like I have to really kind of figure out like how I'm gonna do that. Like I can't think of anything from Animal Kingdom that I can talk about because all of my recent things are season 6 stuff, which I can't get into. But like, you know, one of my earlier editing jobs, like somebody like threw like a bunch of chemicals into a wastebasket and lit it on fire, and I didn't really have anything that worked for that, but I like somehow like found something that was like you know, oh no, that is something, but I had to come up with a way to like make Pop Rocks and Mentos and Coke make a sound once, because just the production wasn't there. So I had to like add a bunch of bubbles and then like a suction cup sound to kind of like do it, and then like a little bit of like an explosion but mute it down. So like sometimes it is sound design, like you're coming up with something. Animal Kingdom is a pretty straightforward show in terms of sound. I mean, as a show itself, it's kind of a grounded in reality show. So there's not anything too wild. Sometimes it's just more labor intensive because of, you have to go and find the sound, because, you know, I've accrued like a vast sound library over all the shows and editors I've worked with. And so that's what I bring with me to every show. And so I'm pouring through that. And then, you know, if I don't find something in that library, I have to maybe go out and find something or ask one of the other assistant editors on the show. I mean, that's probably finding a sound that I don't have is maybe the most frustrating part of my job, or finding the right sound. The least favorite thing I do as an assistant editor is replacing car sounds. Like the car just didn't sound right on the day, and so now I have to like put in car sounds to match. And I'm not a car person, so like I feel like it's always like it's not the right type of car or whatever. So I feel like someone's gonna like catch me in my fraudulence for this scene, but it doesn't really matter because it's good. It's all temp. But yeah, so like it's a lot of that, and then Ian, once it goes back to Ian and he started to assemble the scenes, he'll score the acts, and then I do a mix pass on everything together. Basically, make sure the dialogue's still clear, but you're hearing the sounds. You're also feeling the music, because that's one of the things. Like, it's not about hearing the music; it's about feeling the music. And that's something I learned from Ian. It's that it's not about the volume. It's just like you want to feel the emotions that the music's trying to convey, and that's like can be a subtle thing. But basically I do kind of like a live mixing of it, where I basically hit record and then just ride the levels as I go. And if it doesn't feel right, I'll go back and do it again or tweak. But yeah, so that's kind of all this different sound stuff I do.
Well, that's very cool. A director friend of mine once said, film is the lie that tells the truth. And I think that what you're doing is creating and shaping a world that may not be actually true, that what was delivered to you from the recording of the day, but you're shaping the truth of the feeling and the emotion that everyone's trying to convey. Ian, let's speak now about the difference between a director's cut and the producer's cut. What is the interaction with the producers? And I suppose you're probably dealing with multiple producers, and how each of them has a different take.
Okay, so once the director has his 4 days, then the cut goes to the producing team. And so the producers watch it. Sometimes the director is one of the producers, but more often that's not the case. So at this point in the game, the director is essentially done with the episode. They're not allowed to make any more changes to it normally. So the producers come in, and usually the producers again are the writers, so they know specifically what story points that they're looking for, what themes need to be conveyed, what emotions need to come across, that sort of thing. So they come in, they watch the episode, and they really try to hammer out those points and make sure that they're playing out as succinctly as possible. If there's a direction that we're going in a scene that's completely antithetical to what they're trying to convey or the producers want, then we go back and change those things. A lot of times also, this is the point where, usually our shows come in long. I think Animal Kingdom has like a running time of, was it 44 minutes, Chris? 42, 44?
46 minutes, but that's including recap, main title, and credits. So I think it's really like 44 and a half story time.
Which is pretty long.
Yes, but then again, like a lot of the cuts that we put out after director's cut are typically 5 minutes longer or over. So a lot of that has to come out. So as much as it is important to get a lot of those story points and narrative beats that I spoke of across, it's equally important to take a lot of the extra fat out, or the extra narrative fascia, if you would, that just needs to come out of the episode. That just pulls everything together and makes things just click a lot better also. So that's usually where the producers come in. And once we're satisfied with the cut, once we've brought it close to broadcast time, then it goes off to the studio for, I guess, final notes and rubber stamping.
And when John Wells, our executive producer, weighs in, does he, is that a separate step? Is that another point of revision?
I would say so. I think I guess that would be the final step before it goes to the studio. He's the showrunner, so he gets the final say in terms of what they get to see. So usually at that point, any kind of critical decisions, he's the I guess he's the man who decides yay or nay at that point. His decisions, I guess, supersede everyone else's.
Right. And then Chris, you had mentioned when you get dailies, you check to make sure you've got everything. And then Ian, you mentioned that sometimes your greatest frustration is not having the right coverage. Sometimes we owe an insert, like if a guy is driving in the car at night and he's looking down at a map, we might not shoot the shot of the map on the day, and then later on we do an insert shot of somebody, maybe not even the actor, with a map in his hand shining a flashlight on it. Or there might even be a close-up that, as you mentioned, say that we, when the producers were in the editing room, we felt like there was an actual story beat missing, that we might actually go back and recreate that in order to satisfy the needs of editorial. There also might be a VFX shot that we would owe. Can you talk a little bit about how you cut around those? What sort of impacts that makes on your deadline in delaying mixes, or anything that you'd like to comment on those kind of pieces?
After you,
Chris.
Oh.
That doesn't really affect me as much. I'm usually just making the quick time that goes to crew for reference to sake for when the production makes it. But usually those decisions happen, with Ian and the producer or director during those notes processes where they say, you know, I didn't get that shot, or oh, the director didn't get that shot. We really need this to tell the story moment. So they might slug something in, and basically kind of time the moment, see how it feels, and then we will, when the time comes, I will make a quick a file that will go to production so that they can know what they're trying to replicate, because you can't just send them to shoot it without showing how the show looks, because they need to match what was already shot.
Any notes, comments, Ian?
I think Chris summarized it pretty succinctly. I guess the only challenge on my side is that, like Chris mentioned, I have to time the shot out, and sometimes you just have to use a little bit of imagination in terms of how long you think the shot's going to take. So like you mentioned, like an example where this man is looking at it, driving and looking down at the map. I mean, is he connecting dots with his finger? And if he is, then you have to kind of imagine in your mind him connecting the dots with his finger from point A to point B and allocating the amount of time for that.
And so that takes me then to the final steps. For instance, final music mix, locking picture, etc. Can you describe a little bit about that, please?
I will defer to Chris, because he's like, once I lock the picture, then I turn it over to Chris.
So once we've locked, we do a spotting session with the music editor, the composer, the head sound designer or chief sound designer on the show, our post producer on our show, Terry Murphy, who kind of runs the meeting. And then I think that's everybody. It's mostly a sound-based spots that we do on Animal Kingdom, because visually there isn't much, like, Terry knows what, shots might need minor VFX for. Like, Animal Kingdom is not a VFX heavy show, so it's not something we really hit hard, but audio is usually the thing you really need a spot session for. So you're obviously cutting with temp score, temp sound, temp, all these temp things. So the spotting session, you're going to watch down the whole show, and as you go, whoever's running the meeting, sometimes it's the showrunner, sometimes it's a post producer. On our show on Animal Kingdom, Terry Murphy runs it, and because she knows John Wells really well and what he likes, and she's been doing Animal Kingdom since season 1, so she knows exactly what the show needs. So she might say, this score is a little not as intense as we need it to be, so Alexis and Sam, our composers, can they come up with something more energetic and really driving, and maybe a little like grittier than what we have here? Or Mike, our head sound designer, like this audio was pretty choppy or rough to be, in production. See if you can save it so that we don't have to ADR any of the dialogue, which is something that sometimes we have to do, where sometimes during the editing process, the producers are coming up with ADR lines that we need to record, so to help better tell the story in a way that wasn't anticipated in the script or production phase. But sometimes you also need to re-record dialogue because it just wasn't recorded the greatest on set, or maybe something happened in the background that kind of swallows the moment. So like maybe there's some like action happening, and like just when a critical moment of dialogue happens, someone is also like hitting something, and that has happened, and that is really frustrating and annoying. But that might be slotted for ADR, or it's a lot of just that, going through the show and making sure like all the sound people know what is expected and needed going on from there. And then at that point, they've all seen it, and I've already exported all the different files based on their individual specifications of what they need in order to do their job. So they are always getting a visual reference of the show, so a video of the whole show, but then sound gets basically all the individual tracks plus references, but also like separate deliverables so that they can recreate all the dialogue from the original sound roll production rolls, which is a dialogue editor's job, which is a very, a thing I'm grateful I don't have to do, but I'm grateful that they do that so that we have the best sounding show in the end. Music is only going to be focusing on the music, on the score. The music editor is only going to focus on the score, and any source or needle drop style music will have. The online or the post house is handling all the color. They'll get files, and they might have questions or whatever, but then they will do a separate color review with with Terry or post supervisor, whoever does that on the show. And then once all of the pieces are done, basically the last thing is the mix. Once the mix is ready, they have the mix is done to final picture, and then the sound house will export files that will be sent to the online house to pair with that final picture, and then they will deliver the final master to the network for them to QC and to check that it's all good, and then for them to accept and then put it on the air whenever that happens to be.
So just for myself, Ian, after you've locked picture's locked, and so when they add music, do they edit the music to cut to your editorial beats as opposed to the picture being cut to the musical beats?
That's correct. Once picture's locked, it doesn't change. So it's music's job to conform it to the picture.
So it's like that whole Pink Floyd and Wizard of Oz thing where all of those cut to the beat things is all in my head. So we're getting close to wrapping it up. And so if anybody has any other questions, now's a great time. We do have one question saying, asking, what is a mistake that you've learned from? Great question.
So many. I don't know.
Yeah, I know. I think the biggest one would be to really just keep an eye, or at least just pay attention to the whole concept of Murphy's Law. If it can't go wrong, it will. And so if you have the slightest inkling that something could go wrong, try to cut it off at the head before it grows any bigger.
I think sometimes in my approach to it, cutting a scene, I get caught up in like a preconceived way of how I see the scene based on my initial reaction to the footage. And so taking a step back to kind of recenter myself in the POV of what the scene and the story and the overall episode needs can be really important, and not get bogged down in like, oh, I just had this idea and I want to try it. Maybe that's worth it, but like not sacrificing the story and the POV that the scene needs.
Great, that's a great question. Earlier, you guys spoke about reading the room and managing people and dealing with the politics. Any sort of final advice on how that, any guidance on that subject?
I would say that I think a lot of people go into editing under the assumption that they're going to be working alone in a room by themselves. They think it's like a very kind of solitary thing. It's like, oh, I'm in front of a computer all day anyway. I get to do whatever I want. It's not. I would say a good chunk of your time is spent interacting with somebody. It's not your assistant and the director or the producers. So it's very, very important to learn how to read a room and get the vibe. I would say play it safe at first. I mean, learn, mind your P's and Q's essentially until you feel like it's appropriate to be a little less formal.
A great lesson I've learned from observing Ian and the way he interacts in a room is that Ian never says no to a producer. Ian always says, we can try that. Here's why that might not work, but we can still try it. He's not someone to shut down someone's ideas. He might have concerns or bring up concerns, but he's not going to just flat out say no. He's always going to try to make everybody feel like everyone's moving together towards a better solution. So I think that's something really important. Don't say no. Say, here's why it might not work, but we can definitely try it. And sometimes, yes, the idea is bad, but the person needs to see that for themselves before they know. So it may feel like, what's the word I'm looking for? Spinning your wheels unnecessarily to show them the thing you already know, but it keeps the relationship good if you show them instead of just being, no, that's not going to work, and argue with them.
It's a very interesting point because I think we were discussing this actually with John Wells himself, and he says, with things like that, you never want to crush enthusiasm. You always want to kind of like redirect it or reshape it. So I think that's a very, very good approach to take with these sort of things.
That's great advice. Ali, anything you'd like to add? Anything in closing?
No, I mean, this is just really incredible. And it's been great to get this insight because when our students, you know, most of them are really new to post-production and all of these different types of tools and tricks, it was really great to get a lot more insight on your preparation to go into post and the organizational strategies you use, because oftentimes when there's not enough thought behind the organizational strategy, that's when often our students will lose clips or realize that they are almost lost from the beginning. So I think that this is just a really valuable conversation to get that insight. That is what has really stuck with me. So I think it's great and we appreciate it.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I feel like, you know, that's an encyclopedic sort of introduction to the world of editorial. And I really appreciate both of your perspectives. Thank you so much for sharing your time.
Thank you, Robert.
It was a
Thank
lot
you
of
so
fun.
much, Robert, for hosting this every week. You've been so incredible in helping organize this and bringing so many just inspiring and insightful guests. So we just really, really appreciate you. And now you're a part of the Bayback and Real Stories family. So we can't wait to see you again soon.
Well, yeah,
Pleasure.
so
Thank
I'm
you.
so happy and so lucky to be part of this John Wells Animal Kingdom family, and even more excited to give back to folks who are coming up and enthusiastic producers on their own. I appreciate them. Thank you.
So much.
And
Thanks,
Robert,
everybody.
we're sending you all the recordings as well.
Yeah,
from
we'll
the
send you
past
the
4
recordings.
weeks.
Thank you. All right, bye.
Take care.
Thanks,
so much,
everybody.
Thank you.
everyone.
Have a great
great night.
night. Thank you to
Bye.
people who attended. Bye.